The seminar met on Tuesdays. I know that sounds like a small detail, but everything that happened in those 8 weeks happened inside Tuesday afternoons, and I have thought about it often enough since that the day of the week has taken on a weight it didn't used to carry. Tuesday, second day of the working cycle at the Solène Consolidated Institute. The building was a low, curved thing pressed into the hillside above the central transit hub, its outer skin some pale composite that changed color slightly depending on the angle of the light, white in the morning, a very faint blue by noon, nearly silver by the time the late session let out. I liked that building. I never told anyone that, because liking buildings is not something you announce when you are the only human in a graduate seminar, attended by species who regard emotional attachment to architecture as a symptom of something clinical. My name is Kale Voss. I was 24 years old when I enrolled in the Theoretical Limits seminar at the Solène Consolidated Institute, and I was, by everyone's accounting including the registrars, the first human ever admitted to it. Not the first human at Solène. The Institute had been running cross-species exchange programs for a long time, and I'd seen 2 others during my intake week, a woman from the Tharsis Cooperative who was studying material science, and a man from somewhere in the outer shelf whose department I never learned. But no human had ever been in the Theoretical Limits seminar. Professor Desari Uvith had made that clear in his intake notes, which I received by courier rather than through the Institute's standard messaging system, which I took as either a formality of his department or a gentle signal that my enrollment was unusual enough to require special handling. I had come to Solène from Earth. Technically, I had been born on Varathi Station, in the outer industrial ring of what used to be called the Threshold Belt before the decommissioning agreements brought most of the stations in system. My parents were logistics coordinators, both of them, which is how they met, and which explains more about how I think than any formal education I have ever received. Varathi ran heavy freight, ore processing, and emergency supply staging for 11 other stations at various points during my childhood, and the threat index on the station's hazard register sat at 5.8 for the entirety of my first 17 years. Which in practice meant that something was always going wrong somewhere nearby, and the adults around me spent most of their working lives figuring out what to do about it before it got worse. I came back to Earth at 19 when the Threshold Belt decommissioning wound down and my parents took reassignment. I spent 3 years doing short contract work, logistics auditing, crisis pathway modeling, the kind of thing that doesn't have a clean title but that people hire you for when something has already broken and they need someone to walk through the wreckage and explain what the load-bearing pieces were. I was good at it. Not because I was particularly clever, but because I had grown up in a place where the difference between a workable solution and an elegant one was less important than the difference between a solution you could implement before the tertiary failure cascade and one you couldn't. That distinction, implementable now versus optimal in theory, was one I carried with me into every room I'd worked in since leaving Varathi, and I had learned, in 3 years of contract work, that most rooms did not hold both concepts simultaneously. They either wanted the elegant solution without caring whether it was executable in time, or they wanted something executed immediately without asking whether there was a better version that a little more time might have produced. Varathi had trained me to hold both questions open at once and to understand in real time which one was controlling. That is a harder skill than it sounds, and I do not think it can be taught in a classroom. You have to be in the room where it matters and watch what happens when you get it wrong. The Solène program was a 2-year research placement. I applied on the suggestion of a woman named Sira Okonkwo, who had been my supervisor on a contract job the year before, and who had the habit of identifying people who were good at one thing, and then pointing them in directions that scared them slightly. She thought the theoretical limits framework would be useful for the kind of work I was doing. I thought she might be right, which is why I applied, and I thought I probably wouldn't get in, which is why I did it without much anxiety. I got in. The acceptance letter was formal and brief. It listed the seminar schedule, the Institute's conduct protocols, and a note from Desari himself, 2 sentences at the bottom of the page, that said the enrollment was approved on a provisional basis pending satisfactory completion of the first term's assessment work, and that the seminar expected rigorous engagement with its foundational methodology. I read that note 3 times and then set it down and spent the evening reading everything Desari had published, which took several hours, because he had published a great deal. The seminar itself was Professor Desari flagship course. He was Keth, 4 arms, the upper pair longer and more articulated than the lower, a bilateral ridge structure along the scalp where other species might have hair or comparable features, skin the color of old weathered sandstone. The Keth were, at that point in history, the predominant contributors to the field of cognitive boundary theory, which is the academic discipline that attempts to map the upper limits of sapient problem-solving ability across species. Desari had been working in that field for longer than I had been alive. He had written the primary reference framework, the Desari model, that most graduate-level programs across 15 species used as the foundation of their methodology. He was, in short, the person most responsible for the intellectual architecture of the seminar I had just enrolled in, which meant that he was also, in a way I would not fully appreciate until the 4th week, the person most at risk from anything that undermined it. The first day I walked into the seminar room, there were 11 other students. 7 Keth, 1 Valisi, a long-limbed species I had not encountered before, quiet and careful in their movements. 2 Korathi who sat together at the far end of the curved table, and who I recognized from their brass-dark skin and the secondary visual organs set high on their foreheads, and 1 Orathi, who was the largest individual in the room and who took up roughly 2 standard seat widths. I was the 12th. They all looked at me when I came in. Not in the way people look at someone who's late, or in the way they look at someone who has entered the wrong room. It was more considered than that. A kind of inventory taking. I was used to it. On Varathi Station, inventory taking was how you assessed anything new in your environment. You looked at it and tried to determine what category it belonged to and what demands it might make on you. The problem with me was that most species category systems for humans were built on second-hand information, which meant the inventory taking usually lasted a little longer than it would for something more familiar, and occasionally produced expressions of private uncertainty that the individuals concerned thought they were concealing better than they were. I sat down at the near end of the table, set my notes flat in front of me, and waited for the professor. Desari arrived precisely when the session was scheduled to begin, which I would learn was invariable. He set his materials at the head of the table, a single data carrier and a flat analysis board, and looked around the room once without expression. His lower pair of arms crossed over the front of his work coat. His upper pair rested loosely at his sides. He looked at each student in sequence, and when he got to me, he paused for approximately 1 second longer than he had with any of the others before moving on. The Theoretical Limits Seminar, he said, begins with a premise that most graduate students find uncomfortable and that a smaller number find genuinely threatening. The premise is this: every sapient species has a cognitive ceiling, not a ceiling in the metaphorical sense, not a limit on what a species might eventually achieve with sufficient time and technology. A hard ceiling. A boundary above which the architecture of a given sapient mind cannot operate regardless of experience, training, or cultural scaffolding. This seminar exists to map those ceilings, to describe them with precision, to understand what they mean for cross-species coordination, for institutional design, for any collaborative project that requires multiple species to operate toward a common objective. He paused. I wrote down the last 3 sentences exactly. What the seminar does not do, he continued, is question the premise. The existence of cognitive ceilings is not a hypothesis we are here to test. It is a foundation we are here to build on. If you are here because you intend to challenge the premise, I would ask you to reconsider your enrollment. He looked at the room again. Not at me specifically, but the pause landed where it was probably intended to land. A few of the other students glanced sideways. Torvenska, one of the 7 Keth, looked at me directly, which the others were not quite doing. I wrote down the word foundation and underlined it once, which was something I did with words I expected to need later. Torvenska was a senior cadet. He had been at Solen for 3 years, which meant he was 2 years into his graduate placement, which meant he had been in and around this seminar's orbit for long enough to have opinions about it. He was not, as far as I could tell in the first session, the brightest person in the room. He was, however, the most confident, and in my experience those two qualities travel together often enough that distinguishing between them requires more observation time than a first session provides. He was also, I noticed, paying more attention to me than the content of the session seemed to warrant. Not hostile attention, or not yet. The calibrating kind. The kind that comes before someone decides whether something is a problem or can be dismissed, and that resolves, in about 60% of the cases I had observed, into dismissal, because dismissal is easier to maintain than calibration, and most people prefer it. After the session, he fell into step beside me in the corridor without preamble. "You're the human," he said. "Yes." "Cross-species exchange." "Yes." He considered that for a moment. The seminar has never had a human before. Desari-Uvith's framework doesn't include a human cognitive model. "I'm aware. That's going to make the mapping exercises difficult for you." I looked at him. He was watching me with the particular expression of someone who believes they are delivering news rather than making an argument. "I expect it will," I said, and kept walking. He let me go, but I noticed him watching me the following Tuesday, and the one after that, in the way that people watch something they have already decided the outcome of and are waiting for events to confirm. The first 3 weeks of the seminar were structured around Desari-Uvith's framework in its foundational form. The model worked like this. For any given sapient species, you established a baseline cognitive performance matrix, the range of problems a member of that species could reliably solve under controlled conditions. And then you applied a set of standardized escalation protocols, increasing complexity and abstraction until performance degraded below a threshold. The point at which performance degraded was, in the Desari-Uvith model, the ceiling. Not an approximation, not an average. The ceiling, specific and mappable, above which the architecture of that species' cognition could not consistently operate. It was elegant. I mean that genuinely, without irony. The framework was clean and internally consistent, and the evidence base for it across the 12 species it had been formally applied to was substantial. The Keth students moved through the foundational material with the ease of people revisiting something they already knew. The Valesi was quiet and thorough. The Korathi pair conferred in low voices and produced careful joint annotations. The Orathi worked alone and said very little. I worked through the framework and found it interesting, and also found something else, which I kept to myself for the first 3 weeks. What I found was this. The framework was built entirely from the top down. Every protocol in the Desari-Uvith model began with the ceiling assumption, the belief that there was a maximum, and then worked backward to identify it. The escalation protocols were designed to find the failure point. The baseline matrix was calibrated to the ceiling, not to the floor. The entire architecture of the framework was oriented toward the question, how high can this go before it breaks? On Varathi Station, the question that mattered was never how high something could go before it broke. The question that mattered was, what does it look like when it's breaking? How far has it already gone? And what can you do right now with what you have left? You didn't model ceilings on Varathi. You modeled collapse gradients. You learn to read the shape of a failure in progress and find the functional core inside it, the part that still worked, and build outward from there. I had grown up surrounded by people who could read that shape. My mother could walk into the operations center mid-crisis and identify, inside about 90 seconds, which 3 of the 30 active problems were genuinely load-bearing, and which 27 were downstream effects that would resolve themselves if the 3 core problems were handled. My father could look at a supply routing matrix for a station chain running at degraded capacity and identify the single transfer point, where an adjustment would cascade upward through 6 dependent nodes. Neither of them would have described what they were doing in those terms. They would have said they were just doing their jobs. But I had watched them do it enough times, and I had grown up taking notes, and by the time I left Varathi, I understood that there was a structure to it that was not arbitrary and was not merely experiential. It was learnable if you started from the right orientation. The right orientation was not toward the ceiling. I did not say any of this in weeks 1, 2, or 3. I wrote it in my notes, in the compressed shorthand I developed on Varathi for putting a lot of information into a small space quickly, and I watched the seminar proceed, and I listened to Desari Yuvath lecture, and I mapped the framework carefully, and I waited to see whether anyone else would raise the gap or whether the gap would simply go unraised. No one raised it. Torvenska made a point in week 2 that I thought was almost close. He was discussing the application of the escalation protocols to a novel species, a thought experiment Desari Yuvath had posed, and he said something about the difficulty of establishing a baseline for a species with no prior cognitive mapping data. But he framed it as a methodological problem within the framework, not as a structural gap in the framework itself, and the discussion moved on before it got anywhere near the thing I had written in my notes. After the week 2 session, he appeared beside me in the corridor again. He had clearly been waiting for this. "How are you finding it?" he asked. "Interesting. The framework is comprehensive," he said, in the tone of someone making a statement that is actually a test. "It's thorough," I said. He tilted his head, which for a Keth is a gesture that can mean either genuine curiosity or the preparation for an argument. Thorough implies incomplete. "Everything's incomplete," I said. "The question is whether the incompleteness matters for the problem you're solving." He watched me for a moment. "And does it?" "I don't know yet," I said, which was not entirely true, but which was more polite than what I actually thought. He let me go again, but this time he was frowning slightly as he did, which was different from the previous week's certainty. In week 3, Torvenska presented a brief supplementary analysis of the Desari Yuvath model's application to multi-generational cognitive development. The question of whether the ceiling concept applied to individual minds or to species-level capability aggregated across generations. It was good work. Technically competent, clearly argued, and it drew a response from Desari Yuvath that was precise and detailed, and indicated that the question had been considered before in the literature, and that Torvenska had arrived at the correct answer by a somewhat more efficient route than the published papers had taken. I watched Torvenska take that feedback, and I thought about what it must feel like to have done this for 3 years, to have built up over 3 years a fluency with this framework that was real and earned and recognized, and then to have someone walk into the room who hadn't done any of that and who seemed, by some combination of background and obstinate refusal to adopt the framework's assumptions, to be moving towards something the framework had not mapped. I didn't enjoy that dynamic. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't in the seminar to make Torvenska look inadequate. I was there because Sira Okonkwo had pointed me at it, and I had needed the challenge, and I had enrolled, and the framework had a gap, and the gap was the thing I had grown up inside. That was all. The rest was coincidence of preparation. The assignment for week 3 was the seminar's first major practical exercise. Each student was to select a novel system, something not previously mapped by the Desari-Uvath framework, and apply the escalation protocols to produce a cognitive ceiling estimate for that system. The work was individual. The methodology was to be strict Desari-Uvath. The output was to include the baseline matrix, the escalation series, the degradation threshold, and the ceiling estimate with confidence intervals. Everyone else picked theoretical systems. The Keth students picked abstract cognitive architectures, hypothetical species defined by their structural properties rather than their empirical existence. The Valesi picked a distributed cognition model, the kind of thing that comes up when you're trying to apply individual cognition frameworks to entities that don't think individually. The Korathi pair picked a temporal reasoning variant that was at the edge of the existing literature. Clean choices. Defensible. The kind of selection that tells you someone knows how to work within a framework. I picked the emergency logistics network of Varathi Station, as it had operated during the 18-month period following the threshold belt decommissioning announcement, when the station's operational parameters had been in continuous flux and its coordinators had been making high-stakes routing decisions with degraded information under accelerating time pressure. It was not a theoretical system. It was not a system that the Desari-Uvath framework had been designed to handle. And the ceiling estimate I produced for it did not use the Desari-Uvath escalation protocols, because the Desari-Uvath escalation protocols assumed that the system being analyzed had a stable baseline to degrade from, and the Varathi logistics network during that period did not have a stable baseline. The baseline was itself collapsing. What the coordinators on Varathi had been doing, what my parents had been doing, along with 40 other people in the operations center, was not solving problems from a position of baseline competence and working upward until they hit the ceiling. They were solving problems from a position of cascading failure and working inward until they found the load-bearing piece, and then holding that piece in place while they rebuilt the periphery around it. I had watched them do this for 18 months. I had been 17 at the start of it and 18 by the end, old enough to be in the operations center for secondary shifts, young enough that no one expected me to make primary decisions. I had watched and I had written things down, not in any formal methodological sense, just in the way that you write things down when you are a Varathi kid and something interesting is happening and you want to understand it. My submission for the Week 3 exercise was not a ceiling estimate. It was a collapse gradient map. It described the system not by asking how high it could go before it failed, but by asking what the failure looked like at each stage and what functional capacity remained at each stage. And it produced something that the Desari-Uvath escalation protocols would have called, if they had had a term for it, which they didn't, an inverted ceiling. A minimum viability floor, below which the system ceased to function, derived by working upward from the failure state rather than downward from the theoretical maximum. I spent 4 days on it, not because the work was difficult in the way the seminar's escalation protocol exercises were difficult, abstract, and formally demanding, but because translating what I had watched into something that had the rigor the seminar required was harder than I had expected. The shape of what the Varathi coordinators had done was clear in my notes. Making it legible to a framework that had not been designed for it, using a vocabulary that did not quite have the words for it, was a different kind of work. I produced 3 drafts. The first 2 were too informal. They read more like field observations than analytical methodology, like something you'd file at the end of a contract job rather than present to a graduate seminar run by the person who had written the primary literature. The third found a register that was closer to right, somewhere between the formal precision the seminar demanded and the operational plainness that the Varathi material deserved. I had one moment on the 3rd day of wondering whether to submit a theoretical system instead and hold the Varathi material back. It would have been easier. A clean, abstract architecture with all the right preconditions in place, escalation protocols applied methodically, ceiling estimate with appropriate confidence intervals. I could have done it, it would have been technically adequate. But it would have been work done in a borrowed vocabulary about a system I didn't know, and I had spent enough time in enough operational environments to have developed a reflexive distrust of borrowed vocabulary. The words you use to describe a system shape how you think about it, and if you borrow words that don't quite fit, you end up thinking about something slightly different from what you're actually dealing with. On Varathi, that kind of drift got people hurt. In a seminar, it would merely produce adequate work rather than honest work, which was a smaller cost, but still a cost. I submitted it on time. I went home. I ate dinner and read some of the secondary literature on distributed cognition frameworks that the Vailesi had cited and that I'd found interesting, and I went to sleep. The following Tuesday, I arrived at the seminar room to find the atmosphere subtly different. The other students were already seated, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that several of them were watching the door when I came in, and the quality of the watching was different from the inventory taking of the first session, more attentive, less settled. Desari Yuvath was already at the head of the table. He had my submission in front of him, a physical printout which surprised me, since I had submitted it through the Institute's digital system. He had made notations on it in the small, precise script the Keth used for working documents. I could not read what the notations said from where I was sitting, but there were a lot of them. Margin dents. The kind of annotation pattern that indicates deep engagement rather than superficial correction. "We will begin today," he said, "with a discussion of the Week 3 submissions." He went through them in order of submission time, which put me last. Each student presented a brief summary of their work, and Desari Yuvath offered structured critique, careful, specific, occasionally pointed, never unkind. Torvinska's submission was praised for its methodological rigor, and for a particular handling of the escalation protocol's third stage that Desari Yuvath noted showed genuine insight into the boundary condition problem. I watched Torvinska settle into the praise with the small, satisfied adjustment of posture that people make when they get the validation they were expecting. The Vailesi's distributed cognition work was noted as ambitious and somewhat underdetermined on the escalation side, which the Vailesi accepted with a quiet nod. The Korathi pair's temporal reasoning analysis drew extended commentary that was clearly the longest engagement of any submission other than mine. Then he got to mine. He did not summarize it. He held it up, the physical printout, with its margin notations, and looked at it for a moment with an expression I could not readily categorize. "Mr. Voss," he said, "would you describe what you submitted?" "A collapse gradient map of the Varathi Station logistics network during the decommissioning period." "Not a ceiling estimate?" "No." "Not an application of the Desari Yuvath escalation protocols?" "Not directly, no." The room was very quiet. Torvinska was watching me with an expression that had moved past certainty into something more anticipatory. "The assignment," Desari Yuvath said, "specified strict Desari Yuvath methodology." "It did. And yet, the system I selected doesn't have the preconditions the methodology requires," I said. "The escalation protocols assume a stable baseline. Varathi's logistics network during that period didn't have one. I could have selected a different system, a theoretical one that fit the protocols cleanly. But the system I know best is the one I grew up inside, and I thought the work would be more honest if I used it, even if it meant the methodology had to adapt." There was a pause, not a long one. Desari Yuvath looked at the printout again. "Adapt how?" he asked. And so I explained it. I explained the collapse gradient, and why I'd started from the failure state rather than from the theoretical maximum. I explained the inverted ceiling, the floor, and how on Varathi it was the floor that mattered, not the ceiling, because the ceiling was academic when the system was actively breaking, and the question in front of you was whether it would break all the way or whether there was a functional core you could save. I explained the way the logistics coordinators, my parents specifically, though I didn't name them, just called them senior coordinators, had worked during the worst 3 months of the decommissioning period, when 3 of the 11 dependent stations had lost primary contact, and the remaining 8 were operating on degraded supply chains, and the operations center was running 18-hour shifts to keep the routing viable. I was not describing a method in the formal sense. I was describing what I had watched people do under sustained operational pressure, in conditions that the Desari-Uvith model had never been designed to analyze, because the Desari-Uvith model had been designed from a position of stability looking upward, and Varathi during the decommissioning period had not been stable, and the coordinators looking upward had nothing to look upward at. But as I described it, I could see that the practice had a structure, and the structure was coherent, and it was not the Desari-Uvith structure, but it was not arbitrary either. It had a logic. It was a different orientation entirely, not toward the ceiling but toward the floor, not toward the maximum but toward the minimum viable, not toward the question of how good things could get before they failed, but toward the question of how bad things could get before they stopped being workable. When I finished, the room was still quiet. Torvinsky spoke first. He had, I noticed, stopped looking anticipatory and started looking something else, something more like someone who has seen an argument and needs to identify what's wrong with it before someone else decides they can't. "That's not a method," he said. "That's pattern recognition under pressure, intuition. It's not formalizable." "I formalized it," I said. "It's in the submission." "You described it. Description isn't formalization. The Desari-Uvith protocols are formalized because they're reproducible." Another researcher, following the same protocols on the same system, produces the same result. Your approach is experiential. It's not reproducible by someone who didn't grow up on Varathi Station. I thought about that. He wasn't entirely wrong, and I wanted to be fair to the point. "The specific calibration is experiential," I said. "The pattern of the approach, start from the failure state, identify load-bearing components, establish the minimum viable floor that's reproducible. You'd need to run it against other collapse state systems to validate it, but the structure is there. It's not just intuition. It's systematic intuition, which is different." "Systematic intuition," Torvinsky said, with the careful flatness of someone who has identified the phrase they intend to use against you, "is a contradiction in terms." "Yes," I said, "that's exactly what it is. We got very good at it." The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. I had not planned that response. It wasn't a line I'd prepared. It was just the accurate thing, the thing that described what Varathi had been, a place where systematic contradictions were how you kept the lights on. And it came out flat because flat was how things came out on Varathi when you were describing them to someone who hadn't been there. Not because you were trying to make a point, but because the accuracy of the description didn't leave room for decoration. Torvinsky had no response to it. He was not flustered exactly. He was too careful for flustered, but something in the line had not landed where he expected it to, and his silence had the quality of recalibration rather than concession. Desari-Uvith had not moved. He was looking at the printout. He had been looking at it throughout my explanation, occasionally glancing up to watch me speak and then returning to the page, and I had the impression he was cross-referencing what I said against the notations he had already made. Then he set it down and looked at me directly, with the unmediated attention that very careful thinkers give to things they are actively reclassifying. "The Desari-Uvith framework," he said slowly, "models cognition from the maximum downward. It was developed to answer the question, what is the upper limit of capability for a given system? You are describing a methodology that models from the minimum upward. That answers a different question. What is the lower limit of continued function?" He paused. "These are not the same question." "No," I said, "they're not." "And you believe," he said, "that the second question is the more practically useful one." "I believe," I said, "that on Varathi Station it was. Whether that's generalizable, I don't know. But if any operational system ever reaches a collapsed state, genuinely degraded, not just under stress, then knowing the floor matters more than knowing the ceiling, because the ceiling has already been breached, and what you need to know is where you can stand. He was quiet for a moment. The room was quiet with him. The Valesi had not moved in what felt like several minutes. The Korathi pair had stopped their low-voiced conferral entirely, and were watching with the kind of stillness that indicates focused attention rather than discomfort. Then Desari Yuvith looked at the rest of the room. "The seminar will take a 10-minute recess," he said. "When we reconvene, we will discuss the implications of Mr. Voss's submission for the current scope of the theoretical framework." One of the Keth students I hadn't spoken with said, very quietly, "The scope of the framework." Desari Yuvith looked at them. "Yes," he said, "the scope," and he left the room. I stayed at the table. The Orathi, who had not spoken once in any of the first 3 sessions, looked at me from across the curved table with an expression I couldn't read. After a moment, they made a gesture with one wide hand that I had no contextual reference for, and then they looked back at the wall. I sat and reviewed my notes. We reconvened. The discussion lasted for the rest of the session. Desari Yuvith led it with a precision that I came to understand, over the following weeks, was characteristic of how he handled things that disrupted his framework's architecture. Not with defensiveness, not with dismissal, but with the careful, methodical attention of someone who has built a very good system, and is genuinely interested in finding out whether the new information requires him to make it better, or merely shows him where its edges are. The answer, it turned out, was both. Desari Yuvith framework was not wrong. That was the first thing established clearly, and Desari Yuvith established it himself, before anyone else could be tempted to argue either way. The model was accurate and well evidenced for the 12 species it covered, and the ceiling concept was valid and useful for the problems it was designed to address. What my submission had exposed was not an error in the existing work. It was a gap in its scope. The framework mapped systems that had stable baselines. It had never been applied to systems in active collapse, and it had no methodology for doing so, because its foundational orientation, top-down, ceiling-focused, was architecturally unsuitable for the question the collapsed state posed. The question in a collapsed state, Desari Yuvith said, more to himself than to the room by this point, is not how high can this go. The question is how low has it already fallen, and where does it stop? Yes, I said. And you encountered this as a child. My parents encountered it, I watched. He looked at me again with that unmediated attention. What made them good at it? I thought about that for a moment. They'd seen it before, I said. Not the same failure, every failure on Varathi was different, but the shape of it. The way a working system starts to behave when it's moving toward collapse. They'd seen that shape enough times that they could recognize it early, and early recognition is most of the work. Once you can see it coming, you have time. The ones who couldn't see it coming spent that time finding out they were in a collapse, which meant they started their response late. And you? I grew up watching them recognize it, so I learned what to watch for. He nodded once. It was the most personal exchange I had in that seminar room, and it lasted about 15 seconds. And it had more information density in it than most conversations I'd had in classrooms. After the session, in the corridor, Torvinska fell into step beside me again. This time the approach felt different, less assured, more deliberate, the way someone walks when they have decided to have a conversation rather than to establish a point. The framework gap, he said. You identified it before the submission. Before week 3, yes. Why didn't you raise it in the seminar? I wanted to understand the framework first. Raising gaps before you understand the system you're questioning isn't useful. You need to know whether the gap matters. And you decided it mattered. I decided it was worth putting in a submission and seeing what happened. He was quiet for a moment. You could have submitted a clean ceiling estimate, and none of this would have needed to happen. I looked at him. He was not hostile this time, just precise, asking a genuine question as far as I could tell rather than prosecuting an argument. I could have, I said, but the clean submission would have been dishonest. I picked Varathi because it's what I know, and Varathi doesn't have ceilings in the sense the framework means. If I'd submitted a theoretical system that fit the protocols cleanly, I'd have been submitting work that was technically compliant and analytically empty. He considered that for a moment. He had the expression of someone who has been presented with a reasoning chain they cannot find the flaw in and are not certain whether to keep looking. The framework mattered to Desari Uvith, he said. It represents 40 years of work. I know. You weren't concerned about that. I was. I'm still concerned about it. But a framework that closes gaps when it finds them is worth more than a framework that doesn't, and Desari Uvith knows that. He built it. The kind of person who builds something that good is the kind of person who wants to know when it's missing something. Torvenska was quiet for a stretch of corridor. Then he said, "Your parents, the logistics coordinators, did they know what they were doing, in the technical sense?" I understood what he was asking. He was asking whether they had a framework for it, a formal methodology, or whether they had been operating on pure experience and intuition without structure, whether what I had submitted was genuine methodology or sophisticated anecdote. They knew what they were doing, I said. They didn't have a name for it. They would have said they were just doing their jobs, but the structure was there. I could see it watching them. That's what I put in the submission, not what they said they were doing, what I could see. He looked at me for a moment. Systematic intuition. Systematic intuition, I said. He walked with me for another few steps, and then turned toward his own section of the building. "Voss," he said without turning back. "Yes." The submission, it was good work. He kept walking. I stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the sound of his footsteps against the composite floor, and then I went to get something to eat. What followed the week 3 session was not dramatic. I want to be clear about that, because the temptation in retrospect is to narrate it as though something broke open, and the course changed immediately and everyone understood in an instant what the gap meant. That's not what happened. What happened was slower and more methodical, and in its own way, more satisfying than a sudden conversion would have been. Desari Uvith spent week 4, the week where the assigned topic was normally a deep dive into the escalation protocol specifics, doing something different. He revised the session on the fly, which I could see was unusual by how the Keth students reacted to it, with a faint collective uncertainty that they concealed quickly, but that was visible for the first few minutes. He led the seminar through an examination of the framework's preconditions, not the protocols themselves, but the foundational assumptions on which the protocols rested: stable baseline, upward escalation, ceiling-focused orientation. He asked the seminar to identify what would need to change about those preconditions to accommodate a collapsed state system. It was the best class session I had been to in any institution I had attended. Not because I participated disproportionately. I didn't. The Valesi contributed more than I did in that session, and one of the Korathi pair produced an analysis of the precondition modification requirements that was genuinely impressive in its formal rigor. What made it good was the quality of the engagement in the room. Everyone there was smart, and everyone there was working on something that had not been worked on before, and the combination of those two things produces a particular atmosphere that is difficult to manufacture and immediately recognizable when it occurs. Torvenska was quiet for most of that session, but his annotations, which I could see from across the curved table during the working portion, were dense. He was thinking. It had a different quality than the thinking he'd done in weeks 1 through 3, which had been the thinking of someone working within a known architecture. This was the thinking of someone who had been handed a problem that the known architecture didn't fully contain, and who was trying to figure out what the new walls were. I found that genuinely interesting, more interesting, if I'm honest, than the session itself. After it, he fell into step beside me in the corridor again. The precondition analysis, he said. Stable baseline as an assumption rather than a precondition. That changes the scope of the model considerably. Yes, the Valesi's distributed cognition framing helps. If baseline stability is an assumption built into the framework rather than a property of the system being analyzed, then any system that violates that assumption is outside the model's scope, not a failure of the methodology. Right, the methodology isn't wrong. It's just asking the right question about a narrower domain than anyone thought. He turned this over for a moment, which means the domain needs to expand. Or a companion methodology needs to cover the rest. He looked at me sideways. You're thinking about formalization. Someone will have to. You. Possibly me, I said. More likely a collaboration. I have the experiential material. Other people in that room have the formal apparatus. Those aren't the same skill. He was quiet. Then, a different kind of quiet than he'd used before. Not the quiet of someone preparing an argument or waiting for an opening, but the quiet of someone who has found a problem they didn't know was available to them and is beginning to assess it. The remaining weeks of the seminar were not weeks where I watched the framework dismantled. They were weeks where I watched it extended. Desari Uvith was methodical about it. He did not revise the existing content, the ceiling model, the escalation protocols, the 12-species baseline data, any of that stood. What he did was begin the process of expanding the scope. He brought in the Valesi's distributed cognition work and examined how the collapse gradient approach might apply to non-individual cognitive systems. He brought in the Korathi pair's temporal reasoning variant and asked whether there was a temporal analog to the collapse gradient. Not how much time a system had before it failed, but how a system's decision-making architecture changed as it moved toward failure, and what minimum viable temporal cognition looked like. He worked with me more directly in weeks 5 and 6 than in the first 4. Not out of favoritism. The sessions were structured, with everyone contributing, but because I was the only one in the room who had direct experiential access to a collapse state logistics system, and the collapse gradient was, at that point, the direction the work was moving. The questions he asked me during those sessions were increasingly specific, and the specificity indicated that he had been thinking about the material between sessions, turning it over, finding the places where it was not yet rigorous enough to build on, and identifying what it would take to make it so. I went over my Varathi notes with more care than I had brought to them since writing them. The operational logs my parents had kept during the decommissioning period were in the Institute's research system by week 6, imported with their permission through the Institute's standard source access protocols. My mother had been characteristically efficient about providing them. A single message, the access credentials, and a note that said she hoped they were useful, with no question about what I intended to do with them. Desari Uvith spent an afternoon with those logs and came to the next session with a set of questions that were the most technically specific anyone had ever asked me about that period of my life. He had identified, in 18 months of operational records, 12 distinct instances in which a coordinator had made a decision that could not be accounted for by the information available at the time the decision was made, decisions that were correct in retrospect, that turned out to be the right call, but that required a pattern recognition capability the formal decision framework in use at the time should not have produced. He wanted to know whether I thought those decisions were explained by the collapse gradient model, or whether they required a separate account. I answered what I could. Some of the questions I couldn't answer. They required my parents, and I said so, and he made a note of that in the way people make notes when they intend to follow up. I later learned that he did, in fact, contact them, and that they had a correspondence that lasted several months. I know this because my mother mentioned it in a message, with a tone of subdued amusement that she applied to things she found gratifying but did not want to seem too pleased about. In week 7, Desari distributed a draft amendment to the framework scope document. It was 2 pages, dense with formal notation, and it outlined the conditions under which the Desari model's preconditions did not hold, and proposed a companion methodology, not yet named, not yet fully formalized, explicitly described as a beginning rather than a completion, for modeling cognitive performance in collapsed state systems. He distributed it without comment, except to say that it would be the subject of the week 8 session, and that he expected substantive critique. He got it. The Korathi pair had 3 objections to the formalization approach that were technically serious, and the session spent most of its time working through them. 2 of the 3 objections held up under examination and required revisions to the draft. The third collapsed under the Valesi's analysis, which was elegant and thorough, and settled the question inside about 8 minutes. Desari revised in real time, marking up the draft by hand while the discussion was still going, which was not something I had seen an academic do before, and which I found quietly impressive. The willingness to let the revision happen in front of the room rather than retreating to do it alone. Torvenska contributed a careful argument about the boundary conditions, when the collapse gradient methodology was appropriate versus when the standard ceiling model remained the correct tool. It was a good argument. It was the kind of argument that helps a framework rather than attacking it, the kind that says, here is where your new thing belongs, and here is where it doesn't, and here is the line between them. The precision of the line mattered. A companion methodology that wasn't bounded clearly enough to know when to use it was not a methodology but a habit, and Torvenska understood that, and his argument was accordingly sharp about the boundary. Desari accepted it with the minimal nod that I had learned, by this point, indicated he considered the point settled and was already moving to the next implication. At the end of the week 8 session, Desari made a brief closing statement. He thanked the seminar for what he called, in the careful Keth academic phrasing, a generatively productive term. He noted that the scope amendment would be submitted for formal review by the methodology board at the end of the term, and that the collapse gradient companion methodology would be developed as a formal research project over the following year, with an expanded working group that would include colleagues from the field who had been studying system failure cognition in adjacent disciplines, and who had, in several published papers, circled the same gap without having the Varathi material to anchor it. He looked at the room once, evenly. The framework's gap, he said, was not in the methodology. The methodology was correct for the systems it was designed to address. The gap was in the scope of the inquiry in what question we were asking. The ceiling question is the right question for a stable system. The floor question is the right question for a system in collapse. He paused. Both are cognitive limits questions. The framework should address both. It did not. It will. He picked up his materials and left the room at the same pace. He always left it. The other students began gathering their things. I wrote down his last 3 sentences exactly. Then I closed my notes and sat for a moment in the empty room as the others filtered out. The Orathi was the last to leave, as they had been every week. At the door, they paused and looked back at me, and made the same wide-handed gesture they had made after the week 4 session. I still didn't have contextual reference for it. I nodded, because nodding is one of the more universal acknowledgement gestures in the cross-species interaction literature, and the Orathi left. After the seminar, I walked out of the building and down toward the transit hub in the afternoon light, which had turned the building's composite skin that faint silver it got at this time of day. I was thinking about my parents, about the operations center, about 18 months of watching people hold a broken system together, by understanding what the floor was and refusing to let it go lower. I was also thinking about a thing Desari had said in week 1, when he was laying out the seminar's premise. He had described cognitive ceilings as the hard boundary above which a species' mind could not consistently operate. At the time, I had written down the word foundation and underlined it, because I'd already noticed that the thing he was describing as a foundation was actually a ceiling. And ceilings and foundations are the same structural element in different orientations, and the question of which one matters more depends entirely on whether you're building up or falling down. I hadn't said that in the seminar. I'd filed it in my notes and waited to see whether the framework would surface it on its own, which it eventually had, with considerably more rigor than I could have brought to it alone. That was, I thought, approximately how it was supposed to work. The transit station was warm and busy when I got there. I found a seat and sat in it and waited for the next departure, and I looked at my notes from the term, 8 weeks of careful, compressed Varathy shorthand, pages of it, and I thought about what they were worth, all of it, the observations and the logs and the 18 months of watching the floor hold. My parents had been doing logistics work in a high-threat index station for most of their adult lives. They had never thought of what they did as a framework or a methodology or something worth formalizing. They had thought of it as keeping the station running, which is what it was. The formalization was what I had done with it afterward, standing at enough of a distance to see the shape, and what the seminar had done with it further, pulling it into a vocabulary rigorous enough to build on. What I had not expected, going into the term, was how much I would get from the other direction, from watching the framework work in the cases it was designed for. There had been moments in weeks 5 and 6 when I had put down the collapse gradient material entirely and simply sat in the current of Desari-Uvath's methodology as it handled the problems it was built for, and those moments had been clarifying in a way I had not anticipated. The ceiling model, applied to the Keth cognitive architecture, produced results of a precision I had never seen in the practical work I'd done since Varathy, clean, falsifiable, bounded. It told you with real confidence where the edge was. On Varathy, you were always working with fog around the edges. The Desari-Uvath framework in its domain had no fog. I had spent 3 years doing work in which the fog was unavoidable, and watching a methodology that had cleared the fog in the right conditions was a genuine education in what rigorous formal work could do that experiential practice could not. I had told Desari-Uvath this in one of the week 6 exchanges. Not in those words exactly, I had framed it more technically, in terms of confidence intervals and reproducibility, but he had understood what I was saying and had given me a long, direct look and said, "The practical value of a formal methodology is not only the precision of its outputs, it is the discipline it imposes on the questions you are permitted to ask." He had paused. "Your approach has the outputs of experience. It will need the discipline of formalization before it is a tool others can use." He was right. I knew it. I had written it in my notes in plain script, not shorthand, and I had looked at it several times in the weeks since. I thought about what Torvinska had said in the corridor after week 8. He hadn't said anything elaborate. He had fallen into step beside me for the last time, and we had walked most of the length of the corridor in silence. And at the intersection where he turned toward his section, he had paused and said, "Good term," and kept walking. It was not an apology. It wasn't meant to be. It was what it was, an accurate assessment offered plainly from someone who had come into the term certain about how it would go and had found over 8 weeks that the certainty had been misallocated. That's not a small thing to do. I had watched it happen in real time, the weekly recalibration, the gradual shift from dismissal to attention to engagement to something that might, given time and the right problem to work on, develop into genuine collaborative thought. It had not been comfortable for him. I want to be honest about that. The week 3 session had been, by his own accounting, an ambush, not because I had intended it that way, but because he had arrived in the seminar with a settled picture of what the term would produce, and my submission had rearranged that picture without warning. The weeks that followed had required him to do the harder thing, which is not to reject the rearrangement but to work with it, to take the new material seriously on its own terms and figure out where it fit in relation to the framework he already knew well. I had watched him do that work, and I had found that I respected it, not because it was graceful, but because it was real. The transit arrived. I boarded it and found a window seat and watched the Institute building recede as the car moved down the hill, pale composite, blue-white in the afternoon light, the hill behind it already going into shadow while the building itself still caught the last of it. I had a contract call in the morning. A municipal infrastructure consultancy in the southern districts had experienced a partial cascade failure in their supply routing system 6 weeks ago, and needed someone to walk through the wreckage and identify what the load-bearing pieces were, and whether anything could be rebuilt from them. The job was not glamorous. It was the kind of work that gets done in back offices with bad coffee and operational logs that haven't been organized since the system was installed. And it pays reasonably and matters considerably and requires, more than anything else, the willingness to start from the failure state and work up. I pulled out my notes and wrote, at the bottom of the last page, the 3 sentences from Desari Uvith's closing statement. I wrote them in standard script rather than Varathy shorthand, because they were worth writing clearly. Then I closed the notes and looked out the window and let the city move past.